So I flipped over my page and written the next 6 techniques down. Number 7 and number 8 are going to be techniques about removing the paint. So back to what I was saying before about white paint. In watercolor, we generally don't use white paint because the paper is white. And white paint tends to be more of a gouache. It's much more opaque versus watercolor is meant to be transparent. So we avoid using white paint because it will end up looking chalky or milky or cloudy. So instead, we utilize the white of the paper, we utilize the clear, clean water. So I would rather you learn to paint without using white. People, especially beginners, tend to use white paint like the way white out is used over mistakes. We don't want that. So the first technique I'm going to show you here is lifting. I'm just going to use this opportunity to practice doing a wet on dry approach. And I need a lot more water on my brush so that it doesn't go on dry. You see that scratchiness. I also want to select a darker color, a richer pigment, more pigment. I can use as much water as I want, but I'm going to add more pigment to make it darker. And I'm doing wet on dry. It doesn't need to be wet on dry, but I'm doing wet on dry just so that it dries faster and I can get through these and then return to this one and show you how I would lift or remove the paint. So we're gonna let that sit and then move on to the next one. For blotting, I'm gonna do wet on wet simply as an exercise again to get better at wet on wet. So here I wet the page first. I should see a shine, that's hard to say, on the paper surface. Maybe I'll do purple here. Some pigments are more likely to stain the paper. So in general, if you know you want something to be white, don't even let it get wet. It's finished from the moment you opened up your paper. Just paint around those white areas if you intentionally want them to be white. That said, we all make mistakes. I do it all the time. And I just use some paper towel to gently blot. So what you're gonna do is just press and remove. Usually I'll switch to a different part of the paper towel so I'm not accidentally sponge painting. Press and remove. You can also manipulate where the paper towel goes. So if you wanted to intentionally add, let's say, a highlight somewhere, you could do something like that. Here, for example, it's already pooling up, so I'm going to intentionally just blot to remove some of that excess. Or maybe I don't need to do it quite as vigorously and I just gently absorb the excess paint. So again, press and remove. Now, the wrong way to do this, wiping, that while it did lift, it destroyed the paper. I can see it pilling up. And the other wrong way, this is the worst, is rubbing. You can see I actually left more of a mark on the page there. So those two things are not the way to go, but the most gentle way is just press and remove. Again, it's not going back to white, but it's getting lighter and it will remove any drips or issues. Another thing I've been using are just these towels for absorbing some excess water, although I do like the paper towels a lot for things like this, but those are 2 options. Okay, so I'm gonna let you do that so you can pause and then we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so for the next one, graded 1-color wash. I would say this is our most difficult technique. It's got to be wet on wet. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take my big brush, wet the paper, and what I'm trying to achieve here is a gradation into the color white. Now if I'm doing this on a really big sheet of paper, I would use my brush the wide way. But because we're doing a small sample, I'm actually going to use the brush more like a blade, like this. But again, if I was doing a big piece of paper, I would use it the wide way. So here, it's wet on wet, and I'm just gonna go back, forth, back, forth, back, forth. Something I am not doing is lifting the brush and pushing. Lift, push, lift, push. I am not doing that because I'm gonna end up pushing all my paint to that right side. So instead, and I can start up here if I wanna add more pigment, back, forth, back, forth. The other thing that you may not be able to see in the video is that I'm holding my brush more at a 45-degree angle. So I'm gently pushing my brush against the paper. And you can see it's just naturally diluting, so that worked out really well for me. It doesn't always work that well. Let's do another round just to show you again. So I'm adding more pigment here, and I wanna take some of that pigment and spread it out a little more. If it's not diluting fast enough, like here I don't want to lose my white, clean your brush, get the excess water out of the brush, tap on the paper towel to get the drips out, and then continue. And there you can see I've preserved my white, but also have a nice steady gradation. If you have lots of stripes, it could be that you need to work the paint into the brush a little better, and also just give it a couple minutes as the paint settles. If it's pooling up too much on the sides, use paper towel to absorb the excess, and if you need to use gravity to let it drip, drip side to side, or even down. Don't drip the color into the white. I would say this one is worth practicing a few times because it's a very difficult technique. I'm going to let you pause and do that, and then we will return to this. Okay, next we're going to go back to lifting. And here I find a flat synthetic brush more effective than a round animal fur brush. That doesn't mean you can't lift with one of those brushes, but for me, I find that they're just a little bit stiffer. So this paper is dry now. Of course, it's more malleable because I painted it a few minutes ago as opposed to 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use water and friction. I can clean my brush frequently, get the excess paint out of there, and reapply. Just water. Some pigments will be more resistant to removing. I think these were more staining colors. And some pigments will lift really easily. Some papers will let you lift a lot easier than others. Arches, which is one of the best papers, doesn't like you to lift too much. You can lift, but it's gonna be a little harder than some of the more student grade papers that maybe they're not thinking about archival purposes quite as much. So then what I'm gonna do next is I'm just gonna press and remove. And you can see that got a little bit lighter than this one. And I didn't do any rubbing with the paper towel. I just pressed it down and then remove. So that's lifting. I'll let you pause and do that.